Not your body, not your presence, but the quiet access he once had to your inner world. There is a subtle shock that happens when a woman truly moves on. Not the theatrical kind, not the loud declarations, but the calm shift. The moment when her energy no longer reaches for him automatically. When her attention is no longer available by default. When her emotional door closes without a sound. And this is where confusion begins inside him. Because for a long time, he didn't need to choose you. He had access, emotional access, to your care, your patience, your understanding, your availability. Even in conflict, even in distance, even in silence, you were still emotionally reachable. And now, you are not. As Carl Jung said, what we do not consciously value, we unconsciously cling to. And this is exactly what happens here. When you move on internally, something collapses in his psyche. Not love as a feeling, but control as a structure. He no longer feels reflected in your reactions. He no longer senses himself through your responses. The mirror is gone. This is why your silence feels different now. This is why your calm unsettles him more than anger ever did. Because anger still means access. Explanation still means access. Trying still means access. But moving on means withdrawal of emotional permission. In Jung's view, the ego panics when it loses a familiar source of validation. And you were that source, not because you were weak, but because you were emotionally open. You allowed him to matter without requiring maturity in return. Now, when he looks at you, he feels something hollow. Your laughter no longer seeks him. Your choices no longer orbit him. Your life no longer pauses to accommodate his uncertainty. And that loss is not interpreted as "she moved on." It is interpreted as "I no longer exist where I used to." This is why he feels unsettled when you thrive quietly. Why your peace irritates him more than confrontation. Why your absence feels heavier than your presence ever did. Because the truth is this: he didn't lose you. He lost access to you. And the psyche always mourns what it assumed would remain available forever. What unsettles him most is not that you chose someone else. It's that you chose yourself without asking him to witness it. Because when a woman truly moves on, she doesn't announce it. She reorganizes her inner world. And that reorganization is invisible, but devastating to someone who once lived there emotionally without permission. Before, even when he pulled away, you remained psychologically present. He could disappear and return, withdraw and reappear, doubt and delay. Your emotional availability was the constant background, reliable, forgiving, responsive. That access made him feel anchored, even when he offered very little in return. And now something has shifted. You no longer respond from the same place. Your tone has changed. Your timing has changed. Your emotional temperature is different. Not colder, clearer. As Carl Jung said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And this is exactly what you did. When you accepted yourself, you stopped unconsciously offering emotional reassurance to someone who never earned it. And this creates a disturbance inside him that he cannot name. Because he was never attached only to you. He was attached to how he felt when you were emotionally available. In Jung's view, this is where the shadow is activated. The part of him that relied on your presence to regulate his own uncertainty now has no external anchor. He must sit with himself. And that is deeply uncomfortable. That's why he starts watching from a distance. Why he checks without reaching out. Why your indifference feels louder than rejection. Your emotional withdrawal forces him to confront a painful truth. He no longer has a place inside your inner world. And the psyche resists this loss fiercely. He may try to reappear casually. He may send something meaningless. He may test the door without knocking. Not because he knows what he wants, but because he wants to know if he still can. Access is addictive when it was never earned. And when it's removed, the nervous system interprets it as danger. Not romantic loss, identity loss. Because a part of his self-image was reflected through you. Now the reflection is gone. And what remains is the unsettling awareness that you did not break. You did not beg. You did not wait. You outgrew the dynamic. and that is far more destabilizing than being replaced. What he experiences next is not longing, it is destabilization. Because the moment emotional access is removed, the dynamic reverses. The one who once regulated the rhythm is no longer present. And suddenly, he is left alone with impulses he never had to face while you were there. He feels restless without understanding why, irritated without a clear target, drawn toward you without knowing what he wants from you. This is not love awakening. This is dependence being exposed. As Carl Jung observed, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And now, his unconscious is reacting without permission. Before, your emotional presence softened his inconsistencies. You absorbed confusion. You translated silence. You made meaning where there was none. You stabilized what he did not know how to hold. When you move on, that stabilizing function disappears. And this is where the nervous system reacts. He may replay memories, not because they were perfect, but because they were familiar. He may romanticize what he once neglected. He may feel jealousy that doesn't make sense, because what he lost was not the relationship. It was emotional leverage. In Jung's psychology, when a person loses an unconscious supply, the psyche enters a compensatory phase. That's why he may suddenly want to talk, clarify, reconnect, check in, not to rebuild something new, but to restore access to something old. Your attention once soothed his uncertainty. Your reactions once confirmed his importance. Your presence once reassured him that he mattered, even without effort. Now, your emotional economy is closed. And this creates a subtle panic. Because for the first time, he must generate internally what he once borrowed from you. Reassurance, worth, relevance. That's why he feels smaller around you now. That's why your confidence unsettles him. That's why your independence feels like rejection, even when you say nothing. You didn't punish him. You didn't harden. You simply stopped supplying what was never reciprocated. And the psyche always reacts when entitlement is interrupted. He senses, even without words, that returning will require something different this time. Presence, maturity, effort, accountability. And that realization alone is enough to keep him stuck between reaching out and staying silent. Because emotional access was easy, but meeting you at your level is not. And that is the quiet power of a woman who has truly moved on. At some point, he begins to feel something unfamiliar. Irrelevance. Not rejection, not heartbreak, but the slow realization that his emotional influence has expired. Because when you moved on, you didn't just detach from him. You detached from the version of yourself that revolved around his potential. And this is what destabilizes him most. Before, even when he was inconsistent, your emotional system adjusted. You waited, interpreted, hoped, softened. Your inner world still reacted to his moods. That reaction gave him weight, importance, psychological presence. Now nothing. And nothing is unbearable to the ego. As Carl Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And when you moved on, you forced him to face his. Because without your emotional responsiveness, he can no longer externalize responsibility. He cannot blame timing, confusion, circumstances. You are no longer available to absorb his unfinished inner work. This is when discomfort deepens. He may feel drawn to interrupt your peace. Not maliciously, unconsciously. Because your calm reflects what he lacks. Your groundedness mirrors his fragmentation. Your clarity exposes his avoidance. Your silence amplifies his unresolved emotions. In Jungian terms, you have withdrawn projection. He can no longer project meaning, reassurance, or identity onto you. And without projection, the psyche must confront itself. That's why he feels unsettled when he sees you stable. Why your happiness feels strangely personal to him. Why your growth feels like a judgment, even though you never judged him. You became a living reminder that something was possible, and he chose not to rise. And now he feels the cost. Not because you left, but because you didn't stay small. You didn't linger in the emotional waiting room. You didn't freeze your life to keep a door open. You didn't remain available just in case. You reclaimed your psychic energy. And when a woman does that, the emotional field changes. The dynamic collapses. The unspoken contract ends. He may still think about you, but now it's different. You are no longer a source. You are a standard. And that shift is what makes moving on so deeply unsettling to the one who benefited from your emotional openness without ever fully meeting you there. Eventually, something very specific happens inside him. The illusion of optionality collapses. For a long time, he believed you were there, not actively waiting, but available, not asking, but open, not demanding, but emotionally reachable. That illusion allowed him to delay, to hesitate, to remain undefined. And when you moved on, the timeline disappeared. As Carl Jung said, where love rules, there is no will to power. But where love was replaced by unconscious entitlement, power quietly ruled instead. Your emotional availability once gave him the comfort of postponement. He could stay undecided because you were still emotionally invested, still responsive, still psychologically present. Now, time feels different. Because when a woman withdraws emotional access, the future no longer feels open-ended. It feels closed. Not permanently, but conditionally. And the psyche reacts strongly to that. He begins to feel urgency without direction, loss without language, pressure without invitation. This is why he may suddenly think about what could have been, why regret appears too late, why clarity arrives only after access is gone. Not because he suddenly understands love, but because he finally understands consequence. In Jungian terms, this is confrontation with reality after projection ends. The fantasy collapses. The inner image of "I can return anytime" dissolves. And that realization creates anxiety. Because now, if he wants you, he must approach you as you are now, not as the version of you who once adapted, waited, and softened herself for his uncertainty. And that version of you no longer exists. You no longer negotiate your worth. You no longer explain your boundaries. You no longer make space for ambiguity. Your emotional door doesn't slam. It simply no longer opens automatically. And this forces him to face a truth he avoided. Access without effort is over. That's why he feels unsettled when you don't react. Why your indifference feels louder than rejection. Why your movement forward feels like a verdict. You didn't accuse him. You didn't demand closure. You didn't seek validation. You simply chose alignment over attachment. And that choice quietly dismantled the dynamic that once kept him comfortable. Because the most destabilizing thing for someone who relied on emotional access is meeting the woman who no longer offers it, and realizing she didn't lose anything by letting it go. What follows is the most uncomfortable phase for him. Comparison, not between you and another woman, but between who he was with access and who he is without it. Because when emotional access disappears, the psyche begins to audit the past. He replays moments where he delayed, moments where he minimized, moments where he assumed you would always remain emotionally open, not out of cruelty, but out of unconscious certainty. As Carl Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And now, his darkness has nowhere to hide. Your absence doesn't scream. It doesn't accuse. It simply exists. And that existence forces reflection. He notices how you once adjusted your needs, how you made space for his confusion, how you carried emotional weight he never acknowledged. And only now does he understand the cost. Not to him, but to you. This realization creates inner friction, because to fully process your absence, he would have to admit something painful. That access was mistaken for permanence. That effort was postponed because your presence felt guaranteed. That value was recognized only after withdrawal. And the ego resists this truth. So instead, the mind oscillates. He may idealize you one moment, then diminish the connection the next. He may feel drawn, then justify distance. This is not confusion about you. It is conflict with himself. In Jungian psychology, This is the shadow fighting integration. He must either grow to meet the truth or retreat into denial. And your moving on leaves him no buffer. You are no longer there to soften the realization, to reassure him that it was okay, to emotionally translate his discomfort. So he sits with it. And sitting with it is unsettling, because for the first time, he feels the asymmetry clearly. You gave presence. He gave potential. And potential expires when it is not acted upon. This is why your moving on feels final to him, even if you never said goodbye. Because emotionally, the door didn't close out of anger. It closed out of self-respect. And that kind of closure cannot be negotiated retroactively. You didn't walk away to be missed. You walked away to be whole. And the one who benefited from your openness will always feel unsettled when faced with the woman who no longer needs to offer it. The final layer of his unrest comes from something even deeper: loss of psychological position. Because when you moved on, you didn't just remove access. You removed orientation. For a long time, whether consciously or not, he positioned himself in relation to you. Even distance was a position. Even silence was a stance. Your emotional presence gave his behavior meaning, contrast, relevance. Now, his actions land nowhere. There is no emotional echo, no reaction to measure himself against, no inner confirmation that he still matters to you. As Carl Jung said, the ego cannot stand a vacuum. And when emotional access disappears, a vacuum forms. This is why he may feel oddly invisible. Why his attempts to provoke, even subtly, fall flat. Why your neutrality unsettles him more than anger ever did. Because anger still places him inside your emotional field. But neutrality removes him from it entirely. And removal is existential. You're moving on reorganized the hierarchy of importance in your inner world. He is no longer central, not opposed, not rejected, just peripheral. And the psyche experiences this as displacement. This is where his discomfort turns inward. He may question his choices, his timing, his self-image as someone who was significant. Not because you confirmed it, but because you no longer do. In Jungian terms, this is ego deflation. The false sense of importance collapses when it is no longer externally mirrored. And here is the truth he cannot avoid. You did not move on from him. You moved on toward yourself. That distinction is crucial, because moving on from someone invites replacement. But moving on toward oneself removes comparison entirely. There is nothing for him to compete with, no role to reclaim, no emotional doorway to stand in. Only the reality that you reclaimed your psychic energy and redirected it inward. And that is why he feels unsettled when you move on. Not because he lost you, but because he lost the version of himself that existed only through your emotional availability. And once that version disappears, it never comes back the same. Because a woman who has reclaimed herself does not reopen doors out of nostalgia. She opens new ones from a completely different place. What remains after everything else fades is the deepest disturbance of all. You are no longer emotionally reachable, even in memory. Because when a woman truly moves on, she doesn't carry the past as an open wound. She integrates it, and integration is final. He may try to remember you as you were, softer, more available, more emotionally open, but something feels off. That version no longer matches reality, and the psyche cannot reconcile the difference. As Carl Jung said, we are not what happened to us. We are what we choose to become. And you chose differently. This is why imagining you no longer brings comfort. Why memories no longer soothe him. Why nostalgia feels strangely empty. Because the emotional contract has expired. Before, even if you were gone physically, he could still feel you. Your care lingered. Your understanding echoed. Your emotional openness lived on in his mind. Now, nothing responds. And that silence is not absence. It is closure without permission. This unsettles him because it removes the final illusion that you would always be emotionally available in some form. But you're not. You didn't harden. You didn't shut down. You redirected your emotional energy to a place where it could grow. and that redirection changed your internal frequency. In Jungian terms, this is individuation. The moment a woman stops defining herself through relational tension and begins living from inner alignment. And individuation cannot be undone. This is why he feels you slipping beyond reach, not just emotionally, but symbolically. You are no longer part of an unfinished story. You are no longer a possibility he can revisit. You became complete without him. And completeness is terrifying to someone who relied on your incompleteness to feel needed, important, central. He may still think of you, but now it's different. You are no longer someone he can return to. You are someone he must face. And that is why moving on doesn't just change your life. It rearranges his inner world in ways he never anticipated. Because emotional access, once lost through self-respect, is the one thing that cannot be reclaimed through regret. And deep down, he knows it. At this stage, his unrest no longer seeks resolution. It seeks meaning. Because once emotional access is gone, the mind tries to explain the loss in ways that protect the ego. And this is where he may tell himself stories. That timing was wrong. That it wasn't meant to last. That you changed. But beneath these narratives lies a quieter truth he avoids touching. You didn't change against him. You changed beyond him. As Carl Jung said, nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment and especially on their children than the unlived life of the parent. And in relationships, the unlived life haunts the one who stayed stagnant. Your movement forward activates his sense of what remained undone. The conversations never had. The courage never summoned. The maturity postponed. And this activation is deeply unsettling because it cannot be argued with. You didn't demand growth. You embodied it. An embodiment leaves no room for debate. This is why he may feel strangely small around you now. Why your presence feels heavier than before. Why even imagining reaching out feels risky. Because he senses that contact would require honesty. And honesty would require confronting the version of himself that benefited from your emotional generosity without rising to meet it. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment where the psyche must choose. Integrate the lesson or repress it. Some men grow here. Most retreat. Not because you are unreachable, but because reaching you now would require becoming someone new. And becoming someone new is far more frightening than losing someone familiar. So he stays unsettled. Because you're moving on exposed something irreversible. That emotional access was not love, it was permission. And you withdrew that permission quietly, gracefully, without accusation. You did not leave him with guilt. You left him with awareness. And awareness, once activated, cannot be undone. This is why you're moving on echoes in his nervous system. Why it lingers longer than heartbreak. Why it returns in moments of silence. Because somewhere inside him, he knows. You didn't abandon him. You outgrew the version of yourself that made his comfort possible. And that realization will follow him. Not to punish, but to remind him of what emotional access costs when it is no longer free. What finally settles inside him is not regret. It is recognition. Recognition that something rare passed through his life quietly. Recognition that access was mistaken for permanence. Recognition that what felt endless was, in fact, conditional. And this is the moment that completes the psychological cycle. As Carl Jung said, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. You were transformed. He was confronted. When you moved on, you didn't collapse the past. You sealed it, not with bitterness, not with revenge, but with integration. You took back your emotional energy. You reclaimed your inner authority. You stopped offering access where there was no reciprocity. And that act, quiet, dignified, irreversible, is what unsettles him the most. Because there is no argument against it, no negotiation with it, no dramatic ending to rewrite. Only the reality that you became unavailable in the deepest sense. Not unreachable, unaligned with what once required you to diminish yourself. This is why he feels the loss even when he doesn't miss you consciously. Why your name surfaces in still moments. Why your absence feels heavier than conflict ever did. Because emotional access, once withdrawn through self-respect, cannot be restored through desire alone. And here is the truth you may need to hear, gently, clearly. You didn't move on to teach him a lesson. You moved on because your soul matured past the dynamic. And maturity doesn't circle back to explain itself. You are no longer an open emotional space. You are a completed chapter, a living standard, a reference point he will carry, whether he grows or not. And that is why he feels unsettled, not because he lost love, but because he encountered a woman who chose wholeness over access and never looked back.